Ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to be here to give the last presentation at this conference. First of all, I would like to thank all my colleagues for their excellent presentations. In my contribution, I will confirm most of the theses that have been put forward and will try to present a systematic overview of the discussion on Islam and human rights. I will stress the importance of approaching this discussion in an international framework while taking into consideration the highly and complex nature of the current issues of Islam and human rights, which were one of the main references in the title of this conference. The term teaching, as I use it in the title of my lecture, should be understood in a broad sense. It should not be reduced to a teacher-student situation, but rather understood in the sense of an imparting and advocating. As far as teaching is concerned, it is important to emphasize the existence of two sides or poles at least in this debate on Islam and human rights. On the one hand, we have a constellation of actors and states that see themselves as promoters of human rights. On the other hand, we have a constellation of addressees who are cast as one of their main targets. The first category typically consists of Western democracies, while the addressees are usually Muslim states and individuals. Next come the term human rights, by which I mean first and foremost and refer to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, as well as other universal treaties such as CEDAW and the other agreements on issues such as minority and children's rights. It goes without saying that Western states played a leading role in the creation of these agreements, especially the International Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. Although we should remember that intellectuals from some Muslim states also contributed to this important declaration. Although Western states were instrumental in formulating the International Declaration of Human Rights, this declaration must nevertheless be understood as the result of united effort by all humanity against oppression, violence, and discrimination, and thus it should be understood as an international framework for the broader debate on human rights worldwide. Therefore, it is within this framework that the status of human rights in Muslim states and the debate on Islam and human rights and this debate among Muslim societies should be discussed. Most of the known attempts to elaborate specific Islamic or regional conceptions of human rights have failed. As mentioned earlier, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was pioneered by Western democratic states. As a result, these states have often felt uniquely entitled to or responsible for the advancement of human rights in the Islamic world. This situation has, in turn, sparked debate within and occasionally even rejection by governments, intellectual classes, and general populations in Muslim countries. The thesis I wish to propose here is that this appropriation of the discourse on human rights by Western states and Western actors, what I would refer to as the West's human rights offensive, is no longer possible. It has failed. Instead, a domestic debate on human rights is currently flourishing in the Muslim world, which will contribute to the dissemination of the values of human rights by Muslims and among Muslim populations. Let me begin by explaining what I mean when I say that the West's human rights offensive has failed. The Western appropriation of the discourse on human rights in the Islamic world has played out primarily on the political level, that is to say, on the level of interstate relation between Western and Muslim governments. Human rights have been on the agenda of almost every political discussion between Western and Muslim states over the last 50 years. More specifically, Western politicians have always cited the improvement of human rights as a basic condition for political and economic discussion with the governments of Muslim states. In this context, the issue of human rights was typically raised in the form of demands from Western human rights activists and humanitarian organizations. The call for human rights by Western politicians thus appeared to be addressed more to the domestic Western political opposition and human rights movements than to Muslim interlocuteurs. While Western negotiators concentrated on developing strategies to convince Muslim stakeholders of the advantages to be gained by respecting human rights, Muslim politicians were often attempting to find ways to endorse only those norms that would work to their immediate political advantage. In response to Western states' push to prioritize human rights, Muslim states developed two strategies at least. Some Muslim states signed the international agreements even early after gaining independence from colonial powers, and with the intention of implementing them only to the extent that this would not threaten the power of the ruling elites. In this scenario, the condition of groups or segments of the populations, including women and children, improved a little bit, while political rights continued to be ignored. Other Muslim states, by contrast, sought to develop an alternative declaration of human rights in order to escape Western hegemony. The Cairo Declaration of 1990s by some Muslim states is a clear example of this strategy. But this declaration also failed, as we know. Towards the end of the 20th century, and under strong international and internal pressure, many Muslim states, even those categorically opposed to the covenant, adopted a new dual strategy. The idea behind this strategy was to ratify as many international agreements as possible in order to secure international recognition, while at the same time to attempt to limit the impact of these agreements by a number of reservations. For example, in the case of the CEDAW, several Muslim governments stipulated reservations and limitations before even ratifying the convention. And I have personally observed during my work and my couple of years in diplomatic services, I observed the attentiveness with which Muslim diplomats can discuss these reservations before agreeing to proceed with negotiations. This strategy could be summed up with the phrase, in the door, out the window. This classical human rights debate ended with the turn of the 20th century. The last 20 years, meaning the first 20 years of this century, have seen contradictory situations and several reversals culminating in the Arab Spring and the Iran youth revolution from 2006 to 2009. The current situation can be understood as follows. During the first 2 decades of the 20th century, several Muslim states progressively armed themselves against Western offensive. I repeat, many Muslim states progressively armed themselves against the Western offensive. Many of them joined international human rights bodies, and states that had once been targets of criticism now hold leading or supervisory positions in international human rights organizations. Their newfound status insulates many of these states against Western criticism. The media focus on the issues of human rights violations in the West, particularly in the United States, has further strengthened the position of the opponents of the human rights offensive. The Me Too and Black Lives Matter movements, the storming of the US Capitol, and long list of human rights violations committed by colonial powers and Western powers in Muslim states, in Vietnam, and so on and so forth, have all been instrumentalized to delegitimize Western demands in the area of human rights. Indeed, these and other similar movements and even many and events, these movements and events may spell the end of the Western human rights offensive. This shift is already becoming evident in, for example, the reaction of some Western governments to recent human rights violations in some regions of the Islamic world, which were limited to rhetorical declarations with no concrete action taken. Yet, despite their sensitivity and critical reception vis-à-vis of Western actors, many Muslim societies have developed an intense public discourse on human rights. Indeed, the issue of human rights is currently among the most important topics of discussion in much of Muslim world. This debate is multifaceted. As I explained it, there is a complicated and confusing situation going on. As late as the Arab Spring of 2010, 2011, the issue of human rights was widely and passionately discussed by the general public, especially the youth and educated segments of the population throughout the Muslim world. The call for more freedom and democracy, for the right to work and develop, and for women's rights, for transparency, and the uprisings which accompanied them are just the most visible manifestation of this phenomenon. It would thus be true to say that with the Arab Spring and the time in this and the Iranian youth movements and other issues, the issue of human rights has finally, for the first time, become a popular subject of discussion in the Muslim world. We should recall that in the 1960s of the last century, the debate on human rights in the Muslim world was limited to the elites. These elites were either Western educated ruling classes, which allowed for the introduction of some human rights norms, as long as their own power was not threatened, or religious authorities who largely rejected the Human Rights Declaration of 1948 as an instrument of Western influence. This period was also dominated by the various decolonization movements which rejected any Western concept of human rights in view of the West's highly problematic record in this area in many Muslim states. The debate on human rights in the Muslim world can thus be linked to many factors, including the debate on democracy and independence, as well as economic and religious affairs. In this context, we can observe a contradictory development. Until the end of the 20th century, human rights, at least those that did not directly address political problems, were an elitist issue in the newly independent Muslim nation states. They were of little or no interest for the majority of the population, which was at that time mostly uneducated. By contrast, over the past 2 decades, they have become, human rights issues have become a matter of broad public interest and are therefore perceived as a threat by the elites who fear that human rights reform may limit their political power and their benefits. At this point, I wish to re-emphasize that Muslim human rights education, that is by Muslims for Muslims, is undergoing a highly promising development. A completely new situation has now arisen. The International Bill of Human Rights has been increasingly endorsed even by several Muslim religious conservative scholars and groups who had at once categorically rejected it. Furthermore, moderate religious parties and movements have also committed, albeit with some reservations, to the bill and other human rights treaties. Consequently, it is now true to say that support for human rights exists among Muslim elites, both secular and religious. In addition to the support from the elite, the population of many Muslim countries, especially the educated classes and civil organizations, are demonstrating widespread commitment to human rights. Over the last decade, the Muslim world witnessed a series of popular uprisings which were typically led by young people, women as well as men, academics, and educated. The slogan of these protests typically included basic human rights such as justice, freedom of thinking, freedom, and religious liberty. Even in states where protests seemed unlikely, young women and men have taken to the streets demanding more freedom, transparency, and justice. Although Muslim mainstream public opinion is highly sensitive to any presumed threat from foreign interference in domestic affairs, international values like human rights are now being singled out as a central social issue on which local governments are being emphasized and demanded. Regarding the Muslim position on human rights, we can generally speak of three distinct groups or categories which appear in every context, including among Muslim communities in Western Europe and the United States. The first of these categories is represented by ultra-conservative groups who are limited in number, whose members reject human rights as Western and anti-Islamic. These groups insist on the revivalism of the pre-modern conception, which they consider to be the true incarnation of the values they tend to associate with human rights. The second group consists of the secular progressive elite, or elites in plural. Members of these groups tend to reject pre-modern Islamic conception of human rights, which they consider to be outdated and superseded, and demand exclusive adherence to modern Western norms instead of classical pre-modern conceptions. The third group represents a compromising of a harmonizing approach. It consists of a Muslim mainstream that wishes to both preserve Muslim identity and to exploit the possibilities the adoption of international values offers to improve their societies. In sum, the situation regarding human rights in both Western and Muslim states is complex. While public awareness of and support for international human rights has greatly increased in many parts of the Muslim world, feelings of mistrust and superiority vis-à-vis of the West still run high. At the same time, the advancement of human rights in Muslim states has ceased to be a priority for Western politicians. Instead, several Western politicians are demonstrating an increasing willingness to cooperate even with authoritarian rulers. The principle behind this is pragmatism. Given the complexity of international affairs and the fierce competition for natural resources, such concessions, and the improvement of bilateral relations, they meant to produce or to appear to provide the best chance of eventually helping oppressed groups. Any lesson from the West are thus doomed to fail regarding the human rights. Meanwhile, in the Muslim world, a wide range of civil organizations are actively addressing local human rights issues. These movements and organizations emerge from mainstream society and enjoy great recognition and popularity. Finally, it is important to note that despite my observation earlier regarding the sensitivity of Muslim public opinion towards Western political interference, there is strong cooperation between international human rights organizations and their local counterparts throughout the Muslim world. This form of inter-organizational cooperation appears to hold far more promise in terms of efficiency and local support than conventional official channels. The above observation confirms two basic assumptions. First, human rights are indivisible, universal, and everyone is committed to them except small groups of ultra-conservative religious groups. Second, the opposition to human rights reform observable in certain Muslim societies does not imply a rejection of human rights per se, but is rather the expression of a deep-seated fear of Western political hegemony that needs more development and more education. Thank you very much for your attention.